Welcome to Tech Trends. Tech Trends is a podcast series that provides perspective on the latest trends in technology, fintech, and digital. In today's episode, we're going to be providing some insights into cybersecurity best practices and talk about ways in which you can protect yourself and your company, especially during this pandemic. I'm Anish Bhimani, Chief Information Officer for Commercial Banking, and joining me today is JF Legault, Global Head of Cybersecurity Operations for jpmorgan Chase. JF, welcome to Tech Trends.
Thanks for having me.
So, JF, we've talked about cybersecurity a lot in the past on this on the podcast, and it's a topic that is top of mind for a lot of people. How have you seen attacks or trends getting a little bit more sophisticated over the years? It feels like every time we talk about it, there's something new that people need to worry about.
Yeah, when you look at the trends overall, right, we've seen the creation of a supply chain. So there's really been some optimization over time amongst criminal actors, much like you would see in any commercial supply chain, where you have a variety of groups that have specialized in areas like developing malware or cashing out for fraud. And one area that's been extremely prevalent in terms of the supply chain is ransomware as a service, crimeware as a service, whereby unsophisticated actors can actually procure services from highly sophisticated groups that offer these in exchange for a percentage of the proceeds. So that's actually simplified how criminals can operate. The other thing that we've seen is some crossover between what we would consider nation state actors. So actors that are backed by countries and financial or criminal actors. So that supply chain has actually merged. And then really the major difference that we've seen in terms of the trends and themes is with the pandemic. So early on in the pandemic, we were seeing quite a bit of phishing and other forms of malicious websites that were using Corona and COVID-19 as a theme, right? So the infection, getting more information. And as governments became more involved in terms of financial stimulus, response packages, that's where we saw criminal actors starting to come in. They got heavily involved in using these themes where there was money movement involved. So they benefit from changes in the landscape. Much like we always see sophisticated actors turn up and take advantage of themes like hurricanes to defraud, they really shifted to that. The volume didn't really go up in terms of attacks. What changed was the theme of the attack, leveraging, like I said, COVID and then the stimulus packages.
So there's a lot in there, right? I think the first point that you make, which is fascinating, is what I'll call sort of the commoditization of more sophisticated attacks, right? Where a lot of people might have thought, well, you know, it has to be a nation state or a very sophisticated organized crime ring or something else like that to conduct these sort of attacks. You're saying now it's much more, if you'll pardon the phrase, democratized, right? There's a lot more people that can launch those more sophisticated attacks. Is that it?
That's it, right? They can actually find services on the criminal underground, on the deep dark web, and they'll find actors that advertise services for ransomware, for phishing. And they can, you know, it's really criminal activity for hire on the deep and dark web. So, you know, if don't necessarily have the sophistication to develop ransomware and run the associated campaigns that go with that, I can actually hire somebody that provides me with a platform, much like, you know, we see companies using software as a service. That same concept exists for criminals that want to benefit from this type of activity.
And the other thing you talk about is sort of the changing nature of the attack in light of the pandemic. So let's talk about that a little bit, right? And it sounds like what you're saying is that a lot of the attacks are very similar, phishing, supply chain, things like that, but the theme of it is different. Is that it?
That's spot on, right? So you look at early days of COVID and people were seeking out information. So what would an adversary do in this context? They could create a web page, they could send out emails saying, get more information on coronavirus, on COVID-19, because that's what people were seeking. They were seeking that information. So we saw some of the previous themes of phishing campaigns being replaced with those concepts. And then, as the US government started talking about stimulus packages, we saw more and more themes that related to the Paycheck Protection Program, the SBA, all forms of payments that were going to companies and individuals. So you saw that shift in targeting.
It's interesting. I think that's not just limited to things like phishing and sort of traditional malware themed attacks, but even in fraud, right? I know we've seen a lot of cases where there were a lot of sort of fraudulent sites that purported to be able to get people PPE, right, protective equipment at the start of the pandemic, that turned out to just be complete scams that were out after getting money. So I think it's more pervasive than just the traditional malware sort of things, right?
It is, and we were seeing a lot of recently created websites that were being used in an attempt to resell PPEs, ventilators, respirators, and some of them were entirely legitimate. There were some business models where you would see construction companies had a number of masks on hand that they were looking to resell and trying to do the right thing, while others completely set up these fake online personas in an attempt to sell materials that didn't exist, and in some cases defective materials.
So we talked a lot about how the attacks changed with the pandemic, right? Let's look at the other side, how people should think differently about their control models in the pandemic, right? A lot of companies have people working remotely, maybe working from home. How do companies need to think differently about the way they build their, whether it's security models, control models, or process controls, or things like that in light of the pandemic?
And that's a really important concept, right? Like historically, you had a side of the house that handled the cybersecurity and the technology controls, and another side of the house that handled the business controls. When you look at what fraudsters are going after, they're using a digital channel to impact the business process. So linking the business controls with the cyber controls becomes incredibly important, right? Just phishing and business email compromise come to mind. And what's actually extremely valuable for companies is to think about how money leaves their organization. So thinking through the various steps or the various ways they could be targeted for money to leave the organization, and then move into reviewing the controls that exist across each of these channels, being it right, accounts payable, treasury payments, flows of funds, and then locking those down. And when you look at the context of a pandemic, a lot of controls are highly effective because people are close to each other, right? They can reach out, they can talk to someone and go, did you send me this email? This doesn't make sense. But when you look at the work from home model, right, people are using mobile phones, they're not using their corporate phones, they're not one next to the other. So having that in mind when you're reviewing your business controls and understanding how the shift to work from home has changed many callback procedures.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we do rely a lot on things like callback or out-of-band authentication or the things like that. And I think, as a lot of companies transition very quickly, a matter of days from working in the office to working remotely, I think we saw a lot of cracks in some of those processes, right? And that feels like something people would take advantage of.
Yeah, adversaries are, I always refer to them as early adopters, right? So sophisticated adversaries, even less sophisticated adversaries, will look for those cracks in the controls. They realize that a lot of organization became heavily dependent on conferencing software. Right. So for organizing meetings, and what did they do? Well, they realized that if they targeted in the users of this software, they could get them to install malware. So just imagine the concept: you're heavily dependent on web conferencing software, and you're browsing the internet one night, you're shopping, and you get a pop-up saying, time to update your software. And you realize how dependent you are to continue to operate on that software. The reflex of the individual will naturally be to click on it and update, right? And adversaries realize that.
Brings up an interesting point, because we've talked in the past about how important things like, desktop hygiene and patching all your systems are, and things like that are very clear on a corporate network. But now it's almost as if companies have effectively, I was going to say outsourced, but really sort of, push the security model down to the security of all of their employees' home computers, right? So how does that change how companies should think about that, right? Do you put requirements on people using their computers at home?
It's actually forced us to think beyond what we would normally give in terms of guidance, right? Keeping your computer updated, keeping your antivirus, keeping software updated, but also telling employees where they should be getting their updates from and how to proceed with those updates. So historically, you wouldn't think about providing advice on maintaining home computers in detail because everybody's got a different setup. It's very different than a corporate environment. But you really have to shift that guidance for people to think, well, if I'm updating this piece of software, I should be going to get it from the main website. I should be declining pop-ups telling me to go update, or at the same time, ensuring that they've turned on auto update so that they can decline all the pop-ups. So there's much more work that goes into ensuring that good hygiene is met.
Right. Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about people, and something we've said in the past is as we get better at securing systems, the point of vulnerability shifts from the operating system or the application to the individual, right? Why are things like phishing, and more recently, we hear terms like phishing and smishing and things like that as well? Why is that so important?
Well, it's the main path of entry into organization. It's what allows an adversary to kick off their process, right? So it's either delivering malware or a URL or an instruction in the case of business email compromise. And then you look at phishing, which is over the phone, so social engineering through a phone call, and that will happen as adversaries attempt to conduct reconnaissance. So they're trying to understand the organization so they can then tailor their scam. And then you've got smishing, which is over text.
Yeah, one last example, for us to talk about this too is, we're also faced with a reasonably challenging economic environment around the world right now. The job market's somewhat unsteady in a lot of places, and a lot more people are actively looking for work. And we start to see, attackers taking advantage of that as well, posing at recruiters and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've seen adversaries take advantage of job seekers, right? And we can expect it to happen more in these circumstances. So what they'll actually do is, post a job somewhere, use a very official looking job description, potentially from a reputable company. And then, they'll conduct some form of exchange over email or over IM. And what we saw some of these groups do is towards the tail end, they'll tell the person, oh, to either officially submit your resume or to come and do your interview, you need to install this piece of software, which will enable you to take the appropriate steps to get the job. And, what happens in this circumstance is that, people download it because they have a drive to gain employment. And it's equally important for people that currently aren't employed, but also to consider an organization that might have scaled back hours for employees or that might have cut pay. So if you've got, an organization where they've had to cut back on 20% of the pay, it may drive employees to look elsewhere. But consider that this employee is doing that on their job seeking is being done on the same device that they normally use for work from home, right? So then the adversary is getting credentials into the company. So there's a lot of crossover that happens.
It sounds like not just things like hygiene and taking care of your desktop, but also vigilance and just being aware of what's going on is that much more important in this environment.
Awareness is key, right? Ensuring that you are educating employees as to the threats that they face as consumers and as members of your workforce is important. So understanding how they could be targeted. It's also entails breaking down the risks to certain key areas of your organization. So it's possible that you might have to do different training for employees in accounts payable or treasury functions versus those that are working on the manufacturing side. They're all equally important as a baseline, but there are areas that, require more training and more awareness. And then, some of the things to consider as you look to build awareness amongst employees, or like tabletop exercises. So bringing people together, virtually right now, in terms of having a conversation of what we would do if this happens. It forges relationships. It creates that link.
Let's shift gears a little bit away from sort of the end user issue to ransomware. We've talked about ransomware a little bit before. Ransomware is projected to cost companies upwards of $25 billion next year. And the average demand is starting to push almost $100,000, right? How do business owners and executives think about ransomware, both in terms of its impact, but also what they can do about it?
Yeah, there's a couple of fronts, right? Like we talked about exercises. So just asking yourself the question, do I have a plan if this were to happen to me? Who would I call? Right? So just walking through those steps early on as a business leader and going, okay, I got a phone call from my IT department and all my servers are encrypted. What do I do? Who do I call? How do I proceed? And that's going to trigger a whole number of questions, right? The first one is like, how could this happen to us? and when you break down most of the vectors, the biggest one remains phishing, right? We talked about it. Phishing remains the key entry point for an adversary. And then what do you look at? You're looking at unpatched vulnerabilities and misconfiguration issues around the security perimeter. And then you're thinking compromised credentials, right? So adversaries buy and sell credentials on the criminal underground all the time. If the organization isn't using multi-factor authentication around their perimeter and around the perimeter of the vendors that they use, so the software as a service or anything that's externally hosted, that creates a point of entry for the adversary. So like that's really, for me, is step one, like on the prevention side. Then you have really the detection side, right? So how do you go about identifying the fact that there is ongoing activity, right? Because ransomware doesn't just happen. The adversary needs to get on a network. So they need to find a way in. They need to get a foothold somehow. And they need to find a way to propagate the ransomware on the network. There are very, very few ransomware families that are auto-propagating. And when I say very few, it's pretty much close to none. So the adversary needs to get on the network. They need to connect back out to their infrastructure, bring in the ransomware, and then start deploying it in the environment. So, you have to think through, how would I detect the first phase of the attack? And then how would I detect that lateral movement or that propagation on the network? And we've seen some organizations that have been breached, but their detection mechanisms allowed them to very much contain that attack because they were able to detect it early on. And then you consider, well, okay, they got in, they spread, they triggered. What do I do? How do I think about my response scenario? Who do I call, right? And that comes down to law enforcement, legal counsel, insurance companies, incident response firms. And really what's important is having that plan.
Sounds like you're saying a couple of very, very important points. Number one is the attack vector, if you will, or the way that ransomware happens and comes about is not really all that different from any other sort of attacks we talk about, right? It tends to be phishing, it tends to be credential compromise, things like that on the front end. And on the back end, whether that be dropping in malware to steal intellectual property or dropping in something to put in a backdoor to go back and manipulate transactions, or installing ransomware and encrypting servers. It's largely the same kind of front end attack. So your controls would want to be the same thing there. On the response side, there's a school of thought that says that ransomware is really just a specialized case of resiliency, meaning if you can prepare for the loss of your servers through whether it be a data center outage or a natural disaster, a flood, a hurricane, or something else like that, you're already a long way towards having a decent response for things like ransomware. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question, one I've had to put a lot of thought into over the years when you look at ransomware attacks and resiliency. The major difference between a ransomware attack and the types of scenarios you mentioned is, a fire, data center outage, a hurricane hitting a specific location, is it impacts one data center in most cases. What we see with ransomware is it crosses data centers. So you can imagine what happens if all of your authentication servers across the entire environment are down, right? And it comes back to a problem of how do you rebuild from scratch, which is often something people have not exercised as part of their resiliency scenarios. Meaning, if your authentication servers are down, how do you get the network back up because you can't get into the network devices? And how do you get the authentication servers when the network's down, right? It becomes a chicken or the egg scenario. So, having extremely strong resiliency will help because you have plans to rebuild everything. But oftentimes these plans are designed with the fact that there's still a data center online, or you don't have to recover from what we call bare metal, meaning from a server that has no operating system on it, right? So again, the best scenario here is preventing it from happening. If it happens, it's ensuring that you know how to rebuild your environment, but that still will have some downstream impact.
And also, I think if there's one other thing we've learned through the pandemic, it's, no matter what your resiliency plans are, there's always going to be a scenario you don't plan for, right? I don't think anybody's resiliency plans accounted for, the entire globe being on lockdown, right? Not being able to move work from one place to another. I think people had to really think differently about those kind of plans.
That's a great point, right? Because when you look at a lot of incident response plans and a lot of recovery plans, they're designed for people that have access to the data center, right? And sometimes rebuild plans require connections into data centers and physical presence. The important part now is all of these tests that you've done, right? The incident response test, the resiliency tests, it's necessary to go and re-execute them in a work from home scenario to ensure that they're still accurate with everybody working from home, because there might be that missing connection, that missing tooling when people are working from home that they would normally have in the office.
One of the other things that I think a lot of companies are doing, especially with so many people working remotely, is relying more heavily on cloud-based services, software as a service, third-party software providers, et cetera. How should that, or how does that change their control models and how they need to think about either additional or different controls?
Yeah, it's a really good point, right? Like, you have people that are using their personal devices first and foremost to use these services. So there's some form of social engineering that's possible to target, as I mentioned, right? The patching of the device or something like that, starting there. And then you look at, you're putting your information into a cloud or a shared environment. So what are the tenancy controls that separate the information? So really working through the contractual aspects of this. And if you have some very strict privacy guidelines in your organizations, or you're subject to some very strict privacy laws, it's really ensuring that the contractual language aligns with the requirements that you have.
For companies that maybe aren't as large as a jpmorgan Chase, or don't have the amount of resource to put after this, right? They're still facing some of the same challenges as large companies are, right? What advice do you have for them on how they can mitigate this threat without necessarily breaking the bank?
One of the consistent themes that we always talk about in cybersecurity is the end user, right? Phishing targets the end user. Malware targets end users in most cases. Business email compromise is a form of, email delivery, social engineering attack. So awareness and discussing it and using employee forums, town halls, to talk about social engineering and sharing examples. One of the things that I found very effective over the years is the ability to share some of the examples that have happened to companies in a similar industry so that people really understand what's going on. And then, the security perimeter is equally important. So making sure that you have, as little of an attack surface as possible meaning, all of your authentication is multi-factor, that you're patching vulnerabilities around the perimeter, and that you're really thinking how an adversary would attack.
So really fundamentally, it sounds like it comes down to two things, neither of which really necessarily needs to be expensive, right? It's hygiene, it's making sure you're taking care of the basics on all your systems, and it's employee awareness and user awareness. Just in closing, if you wanted our listeners to take away one thing from this, one thing to pay attention to, what would it be?
It's awareness, but it's also tying that awareness to real life examples. So I'll give you perspective on that, right? We fish test our employees every quarter. So everybody that works within the firm gets a phishing email once a quarter, and we check their click. We check their click rate, right? And we check the reporting rate. So making sure that our employees are advising us of that issue. But that email that they get is actually based off of adversary activity that we've observed targeting us. So we'll actually use real life adversary emails. We'll defang them, so we'll remove the malicious components and insert our own to test our employees. So making it as real life as possible for people and for them to be educated as a result, right? It's not a question of finding the people that have clicked on it. It's understanding those patterns, and that tells you where you may have issues in your employee population and spending more time discussing it. So using those opportunities to tailor your awareness is highly beneficial. And then if I insert a second one, it's practice, practice, practice. So making sure that if it happens, you have a plan to go and address whatever happens to you. A lot of the organizations that are stricken for a very long time are the ones that didn't have a plan in place to respond to a significant cyber event.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. GF, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us on such an important topic.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, remember you can subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. So thanks for joining us, and tune in next time.